The cell was cold and metallic, each wall bare and lifeless under harsh lights that reflected nothing but the emptiness around him. Corporal Paul Andrews, battered and bruised, could hardly feel the ache in his muscles anymore. His body was numb from the rough treatment his alien captors had delivered. His wrists were restrained behind him, the sharp cuffs biting into his skin. He sat on the floor, head bowed, but his eyes were sharp, absorbing every detail of his surroundings, every sound that filtered through the ship's thick walls. The alien guards, a species he couldn't quite place, stood on the other side of the cell, staring at him with expressions he could only interpret as contemptuous curiosity. Their features were harsh and angular, with eyes too small for their heads and skin a sickly, iridescent green that glinted under the light. They were taller than humans, towering over him with lanky limbs and sharp, clawed fingers that flexed with a casual menace. A lead alien, whom Paul guessed to be some sort of officer, stepped forward. Its voice slithered out, a cold, rasping tone layered with barely disguised disdain. "So, this is the human we've captured, the fearsome soldier from that pathetic blue planet." Paul remained silent, his gaze steady, unflinching. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The alien officer chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "Look at him. So fragile, so limited. Your kind fascinates us human. You cling to that soft, perishable flesh of yours. Such a curious design flaw. How do you expect to survive against species like ours?" The others joined in with jeering laughter, some clapping each other on the back as if this display was the most entertaining part of their day. Paul felt his jaw clench, but kept his face impassive, not willing to give them a reason to keep going. But their laughter only grew louder, echoing through the cell like the mocking call of vultures circling over a fresh corpse. "Do you know what we call your kind?" the officer asked, stepping closer, bending down until its cold, thin face was only inches from Paul's. "Dust skin. You're born, you breathe, and then you crumble to dust. We've conquered planets, decimated entire civilizations, and you humans think you can resist us." Its tone was dripping with amused disbelief. Paul finally looked up, meeting the alien's piercing stare with a calm, unyielding gaze. "Keep underestimating us. We're used to that." The alien snorted, apparently unmoved. "Oh, I'm not underestimating you. I know exactly what your kind is worth. Nothing. You're here, little human, because we're interested in your peculiar traits. You're capable of surprising bursts of bravery, though I'd argue they're more like spasms of desperation. Curious, but futile." The other aliens hissed with laughter, their eyes glinting with a cruel enjoyment. Paul knew this wasn't just a routine interrogation. They weren't after information, not really. They simply enjoyed the power, the taunting, the sense of control. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, from human captors, even human soldiers who believed their strength lay in breaking others down. He found it sickening every time. One of the guards leaned in, its expression twisted into what Paul could only assume was a sneer. "Tell us, human, what keeps you going? What makes you think your pitiful forces can stand against us? Your weapons are laughable, your soldiers flimsy. Why do you fight?" Paul held their gaze, his eyes steady. "Because we don't quit, and we don't leave our people behind." The officer rolled its eyes, an oddly human gesture. "Ah, yes, your so-called loyalty, that sentiment you cling to like it's a weapon. You think loyalty will shield you, keep you alive?" The officer straightened, waving a hand dismissively. "Loyalty is a weakness, a flaw we've eradicated from our own kind long ago. It divides you, makes you predictable." Paul felt a flicker of anger stir in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He had learned long ago that anger could cloud his focus, dull his instincts. But he wasn't about to let them strip him of his pride or the values he held close. "Maybe it's beyond you to understand, but where I come from, we don't see loyalty as a flaw. It's what makes us strong." The officer tilted its head, almost as if contemplating his words. before breaking into a twisted smile. You humans are so amusing in your delusions. Tell me, what do you think will happen when we crush your so-called allies and stand over your homeworld? Do you really believe they'll come for you? Paul's face betrayed nothing, though he could feel the words like knives. He had faith. No. He knew that if he held on long enough, his unit would come. Humanity didn't abandon its own, not if there was still a chance, no matter how slim. He'd seen it time and again, how they'd pull each other from the jaws of death without a second thought. The officer seemed to sense his resolve and frowned, the glimmer of amusement replaced by something darker. Well, human, since you seem so keen on your little fantasies of loyalty, why don't you entertain us? Tell us more of these foolish beliefs of yours. Perhaps we'll learn something, or perhaps we'll simply enjoy breaking them. Paul took a steady breath, feeling the weight of every word he was about to say. You may not understand us now, but you will. And when my people come for me, maybe you'll finally realize we're not what you think we are. The alien scoffed, waving a hand. Empty threats. We've seen enough of your kind to know you're nothing special. You're dust human, just dust in the wind. But Paul saw a flicker of something in the alien's eyes, a trace of unease. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. And for now, that was enough. He might be just one soldier, captured and alone, but he knew that the others were out there, and they'd come for him. They always did. With a calm expression, Paul leaned back, a small, knowing smile on his face. The aliens might mock him, underestimate him, and jeer at the values he held, but he wasn't about to let them break him. Not now, not ever. Paul leaned back, taking a steadying breath. His alien captors stood before him, their mocking expressions a reminder of their arrogance. He knew they viewed him as weak, barely worth their time, but he wasn't about to let that shake him. He had one weapon left. His stories, the ones that had shaped him, fueled him. If he couldn't show these aliens the truth, maybe he could make them feel it. So, you want to know why we fight? Why we believe in each other? Paul's voice was steady, each word carefully chosen. Let me tell you about someone I knew, Corporal Sarah Klein. The aliens watched him, some of their grins fading into a look of curiosity. Paul took that as a small victory and pressed on. Sarah and I served on the same front during the Battle of Deimos. Our forces were outnumbered, pinned down by artillery fire that was relentless, pouring down like rain on dry earth. It was chaos. She was injured early on, a shrapnel wound across her shoulder, deep enough to make it hard for her to even hold a rifle. The aliens muttered to one another, clearly unimpressed. Paul held their gaze unperturbed, but despite that, she stayed. She could have pulled back, saved herself, but she didn't. She stayed in the line of fire, kept fighting, so that the rest of us could have a shot at survival. Every time we took cover, she stayed behind, picking off targets, drawing attention away from us. She was our shield, and she knew the risks. But she chose to stay. The alien officer's expression shifted, a slight frown creasing his angular face. And for what? She threw her life away to protect others? Sounds like a fool to me. Paul met the alien's eyes, unwavering. He didn't see it that way. We humans have this need to protect each other. We call it bravery, though you might not understand it. It's why we don't abandon each other, no matter how hopeless things look. One of the guards clicked its tongue, unimpressed. Bravery, a word for reckless self-destruction. Such primitive instincts. No wonder you humans fall so easily. Paul gave a slight shake of his head, feeling a quiet pride stirring inside him. You think it's primitive because you don't understand what it takes to stand in front of death and make that choice, knowing you could lose everything. That's why humans are different. The alien officer rolled its eyes. Amusing. So, your kind is all bravado and no intelligence? Tell me, do you have stories of anything other than pointless sacrifice? Paul's gaze hardened, but he kept his voice calm. Fine. Here's another story, not one of sacrifice, but of kindness. He noticed the aliens shifting, some folding their arms, others tilting their heads as if this concept were almost laughable. He continued anyway. There was a time, early on in the war, when our unit encountered a shipwreck. We had received a distress signal from an alien craft stranded in neutral space, out of fuel, its life support systems failing. We didn't know if they were friend or foe, but we went anyway. The officer's brow raised skeptically. Why would you risk your lives for a ship that might have been your enemy? Because they needed help. Paul replied simply. When we arrived, we found a small crew, 5 aliens, some barely clinging to life. They were too weak to defend themselves, practically helpless. But that didn't matter to us. We patched up their ship, gave them food, and repaired their systems, even though we didn't share a single word in common. We stayed until we were sure they'd make it back to their planet. The alien guards exchanged looks of incredulity, their mouths twisting with incredulous amusement. "What a waste of resources," muttered one of the guards. "To help a species that wouldn't return the favor. Kindness is for those too weak to seize power." Paul's eyes narrowed, and he met each alien's gaze in turn. Maybe that's how you see it. But to us, kindness isn't a weakness. It's strength. It's the choice to see beyond ourselves, to believe that helping others makes us stronger. The officer's laughter was a bitter, mirthless sound. And what good did that kindness do? Did it win you any battles? Paul held his ground, refusing to be rattled. Maybe not directly, but when people know they can count on each other, when they believe they're part of something greater, it gives them something to fight for. That's how we survive. That's why we're still here. The aliens seemed to bristle, their earlier amusement giving way to a faint hint of discomfort. The officer scowled, his fingers flexing in frustration. "Fine. Your bravery, your kindness, quaint but meaningless. You're still just fragile creatures with no real power." Paul paused, letting the silence settle. He knew he had one last story, one that might finally cut through their arrogance. You think strength is just physical power? Well, here's a story about loyalty, something even you might understand. The aliens straightened slightly, their gazes sharpening as they sensed a change in his tone. "I had a friend, Marcus, who was caught in enemy fire during an ambush. He was pinned down, wounded and alone. The odds were impossible, but our squad didn't leave him behind. We circled back, fought through wave after wave of hostiles to reach him, because that's what we do. We don't abandon our own. It's not just duty. It's loyalty, something we carry with us, no matter the cost." One of the guards sneered, though his tone was tinged with doubt. "Loyalty, such an inconvenient attachment. It binds you, blinds you to logical decisions. Why would you sacrifice your lives for one soldier?" "Because we don't see each other as expendable," Paul replied quietly. "And because that loyalty binds us together in a way that makes us stronger than you'll ever understand. We don't leave our people behind." The officer stared at Paul, and for a brief, unguarded moment, Paul saw something shift in the alien's gaze, a flicker of uncertainty, of discomfort. It was as if the alien's own convictions had been challenged, however slightly. Paul leaned forward, a steady resolve in his voice. "You can mock us, laugh at our so-called weaknesses, but know this. When you see us fight, we're not fighting alone. We're connected by bravery, by kindness, by loyalty. And if you ever face us head-on, I promise you'll see that these aren't just empty ideals. They're what make us human. They're what make us strong." The aliens were silent now, their previous derision replaced with an uneasy tension. Paul could see their skepticism battling with a growing, reluctant respect. He leaned back, his gaze unwavering. They might not understand it now, he thought, but they would. Soon enough, they'd see just how resilient humanity could be. Paul studied the aliens' expressions as they digested his words, their mocking smirks replaced by expressions of reluctant intrigue. He knew he had pricked their arrogance, but he had more to show them. If they thought humans were only capable of fleeting acts of bravery or kindness, He would make them understand just how far human ingenuity could go, and how their underestimation of humanity was a grave mistake. "Your stories amuse us human," sneered the alien officer, though his voice wavered with something unsteady. "But bravery and kindness are nothing compared to true power." Paul allowed himself a thin smile. "You think we're powerless? That's another thing you don't understand about us. We might not have your advanced technology or your organic weapons, but we know how to fight. And we know how to make the most out of what we've got." The officer rolled his eyes dismissively, yet Paul caught a slight twitch of his jaw. The alien was trying to hide his interest, but Paul pressed on, his voice steady and calm. "Let me tell you about the Battle of Fort Arden. That fort was our last stand, just a battered bunker, barely reinforced with anything other than sandbags and stubborn grit. The enemy, a species a lot like yours, had us surrounded, outgunned, and outnumbered. But we had something they didn't expect." The officer raised a brow, clearly skeptical. "And what could you possibly have had? From what I've seen, your weapons are crude, inefficient, weak." Paul chuckled, his eyes glinting with defiance. "Crude, maybe, but effective. Our engineers had rigged up explosive devices from leftover parts, things our enemies would never have looked twice at. They were simple but devastating. Those explosives tore through the enemy ranks because we knew how to think fast, how to use what we had." The officer's gaze narrowed, the mocking edge softening. Paul saw that his story was sinking in, sparking questions the alien might not want to admit he had. Paul leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "You call our weapons crude because they're different from yours, but that doesn't make them weak. In fact, it's often the simplest tools that turn the tide. Our forces didn't survive because we had better gear. We survived because we knew how to adapt." A few of the alien guards glanced at each other uneasily, perhaps recalling the tales they'd heard of human forces managing to stand their ground against impossible odds. Paul could see the uncertainty growing, though the officer still sneered. "So, your species is clever at improvising," the officer muttered dismissively. "But in the face of true power like ours, your tricks would crumble. Your species couldn't stand up to the technology we possess." Paul felt his pulse quicken, a determined fire sparking inside him. "Let me tell you about one of those tricks. Have you ever heard of the Wraith?" The officer frowned, visibly thrown off. Paul savored that brief moment of silence before continuing. "The Wraith is a craft we developed, a stealth fighter that moves through enemy lines undetected. It's virtually invisible to all conventional sensors, able to cloak itself from sight, sound, and even radar. The Wraith can drop right into hostile territory without leaving a trace. By the time you see it, it's already too late." The officer's eyes narrowed further, his amusement gone, replaced by a sliver of wariness. "A cloaked ship? Your kind developed that." Paul gave a slight nod. "Oh, we've developed a lot of things. But it's not just a Wraith. We've created EMP blasts that disable even the most advanced enemy electronics. Our engineers figured out how to modify small arms, rifles that are powerful enough to pierce even the strongest exoskeleton armor. You might see us as limited, but we turn those limitations into strengths. We learn, we adapt, and we innovate constantly." The aliens looked at one another, and Paul could see the tension creeping into their expressions. Gone were the arrogant smirks, replaced by thoughtful, guarded looks. They were beginning to realize that their assumptions about humans had been wrong, that humans were far from defenseless, and that underestimating them had been a mistake. The officer's voice was lower now, laced with disbelief. "You expect us to believe that you, a species still relying on such primitive tech, could create tools that match ours?" Paul met his gaze unblinking. "I don't care if you believe it. You'll see it for yourself soon enough. And you'll see that we don't just build weapons to intimidate or conquer. We build them to protect each other, to make sure we survive." A silence fell over the group, tension thickening the air. Paul let his words linger, watching as the realization sank into his captors. They had captured him thinking him weak, a simple human soldier who could do nothing against their superior power. Now, they were beginning to understand that humanity's strength lay not just in their tools, but in their determination and resourcefulness. The officer glared at him, but the mocking edge had vanished from his voice. "So, you're saying your people are capable of anything, that you're not afraid to fight us?" Paul smiled, though there was no humor in it. "We're not afraid of anything, especially when it comes to protecting our own. If you knew anything about us, you'd know that humans don't abandon each other. And if one of us is taken, the others don't stop until they get them back." The officer's face hardened, and Paul could see the slight tremor of uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The alien had heard stories, perhaps dismissed them as rumors. But now, faced with Paul's calm resolve, he was beginning to doubt. "So, they'll come for you?" the officer asked, voice strained with disbelief. Paul nodded, his voice a quiet promise. "They'll come. They'll come with every weapon, every bit of tech we've developed. And when they do, you'll understand why it's a mistake to underestimate us." The officer's face tightened, his defiance giving way to something like dread. Paul could see the cracks forming in the alien's confidence, the fear that came with the realization of just how resilient and resourceful humans could be. In that moment, Paul knew he had planted a seed of doubt, fear, and the realization that humans, though underestimated, were far more formidable than these aliens had believed. And as he leaned back, silent and steady, he could sense the shift in the air. His captors might still hold him now, but they understood that they had miscalculated, and that this miscalculation might cost them dearly. The silence in the cell was dense, heavy with the weight of Paul's words. The alien officer's gaze was fixed on him, yet the arrogance in his eyes had shifted to something more guarded, almost wary. Paul had spent hours sharing stories of human ingenuity and resilience, and he could tell his captors were beginning to question everything they thought they knew about humans. But he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to break their arrogance entirely. A sudden, blaring alarm shattered the quiet, red lights flashing through the narrow hallway outside Paul's cell. The guards looked at each other, their smug confidence flickering into panic. The officer barked something in their language, his voice tight with urgency. Paul suppressed a smile, his heart pounding with the fierce hope he'd been clinging to. They were here. One of the guards' communication devices buzzed frantically. He raised it to his ear, his alien features contorting in shock as he listened. The officer snatched the device, and as he did, Paul caught snippets of a transmission that filled him with both pride and relief. Unknown fleet detected. Human signatures confirm evasive maneuvers failing, defensive systems compromised. Paul kept his face impassive, though he felt a thrill of triumph at the words. Humanity had come for him, just as he'd known they would. It didn't matter that he was just one soldier. His people weren't the kind to leave anyone behind, and now his captors were about to understand what that truly meant. The officer looked at Paul, his mask of disdain beginning to crack. "Your people are fools," he spat, though his voice was strained with barely concealed fear. "They risk annihilation over one insignificant soldier. You're nothing to them." Paul shook his head, his voice calm. "You still don't get it, do you? To us, every life matters. We don't see each other as expendable. That's why they're here, and that's why you've already lost." The officer's hands clenched, his desperation slipping through his facade. "Our ships, our technology, they're superior. Your forces won't last." As if in response, a low rumble vibrated through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. Paul knew the sound well. It was the approach of human drop pods, barreling through the atmosphere with deadly precision. He watched the realization dawn on his captors' faces, their confidence finally crumbling. The officer's eyes widened, his voice dropping to a fearful whisper. "How did they bypass our shields?" Paul leaned forward, his expression unyielding. "Because we're adaptable. You thought your defenses would keep you safe, but we're always finding ways around what others think is impossible. And right now, every one of those soldiers out there is focused on one goal: getting me back. The guards exchanged panicked glances, some already edging toward the door, fear written across their faces. The officer, however, remained frozen, torn between disbelief and a growing dread. In that instant, the walls shook with a forceful blast, and the lights overhead flickered. The sharp, unmistakable sounds of human weaponry rang through the halls. A guard near the door peered out, only to recoil, his face twisted with terror. The humans were close, moving with a determination and precision that shook even the most disciplined of the alien soldiers. The officer's voice broke into a frenzied shout. "Seal the doors! They must not reach us!" But his command was laced with panic, his confidence crumbling in the face of the humans' relentless advance. Paul felt a surge of pride for his people. These aliens might have superior technology, but they lacked the indomitable spirit that humans carried into every battle. His rescuers were willing to risk everything, fighting tooth and nail to retrieve one of their own. The aliens couldn't understand it, couldn't comprehend a loyalty that strong, a dedication that unwavering. The door to the cell buckled under a massive impact, and the guards raised their weapons, their hands trembling. Paul watched them, their terror apparent in the way they glanced from him to the door, as if realizing that everything they had believed about human weakness was a lie. They were facing a force far beyond anything they had anticipated. With a deafening crash, the door was ripped open, and a squad of human soldiers burst through, their armor gleaming under the dim lights, weapons aimed with practiced precision. At their head was Sergeant Avery, a familiar face Paul had fought beside many times. Her gaze locked onto him, a fierce resolve blazing in her eyes. "About time you showed up," Paul said with a grin, unable to hide his relief. Avery smirked, giving him a nod. "Couldn't let you have all the fun, could we?" She turned her gaze to the aliens, her expression hardening. "We don't take kindly to people who think they can mess with our own." The officer took a step back, his face pale, his eyes darting between the human soldiers as if searching for an escape. He stammered, trying to salvage his authority. You can't all survive. We'll crush you. Our fleet will." Avery cut him off, her voice cold and unyielding. "Your fleet is in pieces. Our forces are jamming your comms, and our EMPs have taken out your defenses. You underestimated us. That was your first mistake." One of the human soldiers moved to Paul, breaking his restraints. He stood, his body sore but his spirit stronger than ever. He looked back at the officer, who now wore an expression of utter defeat, the weight of his errors settling in. "You want to know what makes us different," Paul said quietly, addressing the officer. "It's this. We don't abandon each other, and we don't back down, no matter the cost." The officer's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. He simply stood there, defeated, as the human soldiers led Paul out of the cell, leaving the alien captives behind to reckon with their humiliation. As they made their way through the corridors of the ship, the sounds of battle echoed from every direction. Paul could see the determination in his squad's faces, their focus on the mission unshakable. It wasn't just about him. It was about every soldier who had ever risked their life for another, every human who believed in something greater than themselves. They reached the exit bay, where transport ships were waiting to take them back to safety. Paul paused, looking back at the alien vessel one last time. He knew the aliens would never forget this day, the day they realized what humanity was truly capable of. As they boarded the transport, Avery clapped a hand on Paul's shoulder. "Ready to go home?" He nodded, a grin breaking across his face. More than ready. The door sealed, and as the ship lifted off, Paul watched the alien craft grow smaller in the distance. They might have captured him, mocked him, tried to break him, but they had only given him a chance to show them the strength of human resilience, ingenuity, and loyalty. And in the end, that strength had won. As they sped away, Paul felt a surge of pride for his people and a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the aliens now understood the one truth they had failed to see. Humanity was a force they should never, ever underestimate.